All right, this chapter is going to focus on membrane structure and function. What that means is how cells move things in and out of the cell. We're going to start talking about the membrane again and just do a quick review, add some more details that we didn't get in chapter 4. But then the end of this chapter is going to more focus on how, again, cells move and transport things in and past the cell membrane. All right, so last chapter we talked about the plasma membrane, and just to review a couple of things here, again, it's on the black background, so I usually don't have students write things that are on a black background, but it's just that bilayer of phospholipids. In college prep bio and 9th and 10th grade bio, you guys learned that the plasma membrane is made of these phospholipids, and you probably also talked about how they're made of proteins and sometimes the cholesterol here. One thing we see in AP bio is, again, complexity increasing. We see the complexity here of the plasma membrane is much, much higher than what you learned in college prep bio. A lot more going on here. That's what it means. There's a lot more structures, a lot of diversity in all these membrane proteins and things like that. So just understand this plasma membrane is what you saw in college prep bio, but it's going to become more complex here in AP bio. Coming back to this image, the glycoproteins and glycolipids, we talked about these before. We're just going to mention them here again. Again, the glycolipids, that glyco part just means the sugar. Glycolipids and glycoproteins, these are just identifiers of the cell that your immune system is going to use. Your ABO blood system is an example of the glycoproteins and glycolipids. They're just going to identify your cells versus non-cells, and that helps us out with our immune system. One of the molecules that we're going to add in here is called cholesterol. Now, cholesterol, you can see, is this 4-ring steroid, which is technically a lipid. We find it within the plasma membrane, and what it does is it adds in more flexibility to the plasma membrane. Again, if it's too rigid that the organism can't move and function correctly, we want the plasma membrane to be very fluid. So this cholesterol adds into that fluidity. This animation here shows us that the phospholipids are moving all around. Don't think of this as a static thing. The static nature of this image isn't a good representation of what actually is occurring in your plasma membrane. These phospholipids are moving all around. They're flipping actually from one side to the next. There's a lot of movement in this plasma membrane. We also call this the fluid mosaic model because, again, it moves. There's a lot more to it. So again, it's more fluid. It's more complex. There's a lot more molecules than just the phospholipids. All right, so the membrane also is called selectively permeable, which means only certain things are going to be allowed past the membrane. Now, again, cells don't actually think about what's going in and out of the cell. This is all just by nature. This is by by cellular properties and properties of the plasma membrane. So don't think like the cell is actually thinking like, hey, I want this and I don't want this. These are a lot of times just properties of molecules and if they can pass through the membrane or not. Now, there is signal transduction, which is cell communication, but we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. Since nonpolar molecules can easily cross polar molecules need energy Y. This is because, again, the majority of a plasma membrane is going to be nonpolar with the tails. So it's going to be easy for nonpolar molecules to get across. The polar ones, they're going to take a little bit more time just because the attraction forces there and the repulsion forces. You can see here that nonpolar area where the tails are, the polar heads. We learned that, again, the heads are polar because of the oxygen back in the macromolecule section. Larger molecules aren't going to be able to easily cross. It's just like, think about this large molecule trying to get through all these phospholipids. It's going to have a tough time making its way through. Uncharged particles, yep, they can easily move past the membrane. Water typically goes through these aquaporons. Charged ions, again, they have a tough time because they're either usually polar or non-polar. Aquaporins are a type of membrane protein we're going to see specifically help water molecules go back and forth through the membrane. These just aid in water transport, which we're going to talk about later in this chapter with osmosis. Aquaporins, these are easy. Just remember aqua means water, and they're going to allow passage of water to go more easily past the membrane. Two types of membrane proteins. So again, we talked about membrane proteins a little bit last chapter. We're going to get more in depth here. Integral membrane proteins, they go the whole way through. You can see here these two integral membrane proteins, they go the whole way through the plasma membrane. So just think into the plasma membrane. Peripheral proteins don't go the whole way through. They can be attached to membrane proteins that are integral. They can be on one side or the other, or they can even actually be within the membrane, but they're not going to go the whole way through. So again, think about your peripheral visions on the outside. Your integrals are on the inside. There are 6 types of membrane proteins. Again, in college prep bio in the beginning of the year, we talked about membrane proteins. There are actually 6 different types. Now, there are a lot of diversity within each type, but the main 6 types are we're going to talk about channel and carrier proteins here. Channel proteins allow the crossing of molecules without any energy. These are like the aquaporons. They're just going to allow the water to flow through. Carrier proteins are going to change shape as they allow certain substances to come into or out of the cell. These usually require some energy since they're changing shape. Next are cell recognition proteins. These are the glycoproteins, and there's other types of cell recognition proteins. But all you need to know is these guys, they deal with the immune system and help your immune cells signify or identify pathogens versus your own cells. Receptor proteins, we spend a whole chapter on receptor proteins. These are really interesting. It's called cell communication or signal transduction. Whenever a molecule recognizes and bonds with the receptor proteins, it's going to send a signal into the cell and create a response, some type of cellular response. We're going to get into that again in the next chapter. Our last 2 proteins are called enzymatic and junction proteins. We talked about enzymes back in college prep bio, but enzymes are just molecules that either break down or build things up. We're going to see these in the plasma membrane. One of my favorite enzymes is ATP synthase. We see ATP synthase within the plasma membrane. Junction proteins is probably our least talked about. These are just locations where you're going to have anchors or like you have places where you can communicate between 2 cells. We talk about plasmodesmata, which are a type of junction proteins later on in this chapter.